I'm Priscilla.
What's up, guys? I'm Brittany.
And I'm Jahari, and welcome to our podcast, The Ninth Semester with PB&J.
Welcome to episode 5, Homecoming. Today, we're talking about preparing for the awkward conversations with alumni in the months after graduation, including the big question, so what are you doing now?
Well.
So when this episode comes out, we're like halfway through the season, right?
We're past halfway. This is our
This is actually the one
we only
episode
have
after
three
half
more
the
after
pump.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have 3 more episodes after this. So we've already hit the midway point.
That's awesome.
Yay!
Oh my goodness.
So this episode I guess is gonna be a little bit more reflective, if you will. Because I think so obviously we're talking about what happens in the graduation year. And specifically, like we're talking about the reason why it's called homecoming is because we're talking about like what happens between May and October, right? That 5 months where, usually you probably by traditional standards, right, you would have been settled into a job, settled into wherever you were going to live, whether that be at home, in your home city, in another city, whatever, that you made your move, and then you come back to kind of like experience the school again, right? Through homecoming, right? To talk to the people that you used to go to school with just a couple months ago. Talk to the people, right, that were in school, before you, older alums, network, have fun, eat a burger if the people finally get their tailgate correct. Um, see the losing football team in our case.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that creates a kind of environment of like anxiety and insecurity that's not really talked about as much because people are just kind of like toxic positivists and like, oh, just come anyway, right? Or, oh, don't worry about that. Like, it's perfectly normal. And, or like, oh, you'll find something. And it's just like, well, that's not really helpful.
It doesn't really help in
Because
the
the
reality of
social,
it.
right, the
Mhm.
reality of the situation is that everybody I see is going to ask, so what are you doing now?
Right.
And that's going to, and because of, I guess, how stigmatized like unemployment or underemployment is, right, and how overstated, right, like the pipeline, the job pipeline, career pipeline after you graduate with a 4-year degree is very distorted now than, let's say maybe 30 years ago. And I don't even know if people who graduate 30 years ago would agree. Because we're entering the job force in this like very uh downwardly spiraling like economic market, right? People everywhere from tech to news to where and everywhere in between are losing their jobs at like very, very high rates while people at the top are kind of gaining more and more money. Um and it's leaving a lot of the entry level people kind of stuck in like, well, what do I do? Do I just go back to school and off put this for a little while, right? Or do I, brave the storm and put myself through it and risk my mental health through and risk, all of these kind of like intrinsic factors, right? For the sake of trying to be rigorous about how I find a job and when I find a job, right? Like I wouldn't have gone back to homecoming anyway because 5 months later, what's the point? Um, but I think I also have to be real about like at that time I did not have a job, so it was kind of like, okay, I come back. What am I going to do? Lie? I mean, I could do that, but that's not
Make up a story.
right. Like make up a story. Oh, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, but that's not real, and that's not. I, I don't feel like it should just be necessary. We should all just kind of hang out. Why are we still, it's natural for people to want to know. I'm going to stop talking after this. But for people to want to know what you're up to right after, you've been away for a while. But it is a very anxiety producing environment.
No, yeah. I think like you kind of covered a lot of good conversation as an intro into the talk that we want to have today. I know we all kind of had a similar mindset going into homecoming in our first year at least. It's like, yeah, I was just on campus like 3 months ago, like still starting my life off in the quote unquote adult world. So we don't feel the need to go back. But I know, like, again, like you said, if you were to go back, right, there is always that question. So what are you doing now? So what are you doing now? By every single person you probably run into. So preparing that mindset of, yeah, even if you're in a job force, it's like, oh, what do you say? What do you say when you feel like your role is just starting out? It's like, actually, I'm just kind of in training sessions right now. I don't really know what I do yet. Uh, kind of conversations.
I think, while we talk about how sometimes it can be very kind of nerve wracking to go to events like that, I know one of my favorite memories from the past summer after graduation is I went to a alumni event that our alumni office put together, and it was essentially an event that past alumni came, or I would say past recent alumni came. So within, usually, I don't think there was anybody there that graduated more, that was more from 10 years out from their graduation date, or after their graduation date is the best way to say it. And they bought all of our first drinks and had some snacks and stuff there. And it was really, to me, relieving that I went, because I remember, I can't remember if I called Jahari beforehand, but I was going, it might have been another one of our friends, that I was going back and forth about going or not, because it was literally, this event it might have been in May, late May, if not early June. And I was going back and forth on going because it was specifically targeted for our graduating class. So I knew it was going to be fun to see everybody again, even though it was just been a couple weeks since graduation. But it's always, that side of, well, what else? You kind of tap into that inner alum with the question of, like, I wonder what everybody else is going or doing afterwards or right now. And in the end, I was really happy that I went, because there was definitely a whole bunch of, I don't know what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of chillaxing, or I just got something right now to make some money before I transition to the thing I really want to do. And that for me was really fun, because I don't know, it just kind of brought me some relief of, like, oh, it's not just me out here, struggling, or it's not just me. I think there's, while it could be very nerve wracking to kind of maybe repeatedly tell that alum who's asking the big question of, what are you doing, the same thing over again, whether it's, I don't know, or, here's this company I'm going to work for. I don't know, for me, going to an event right after graduation and hearing that everybody was in the same boat, that's also kind of a diverting side of, going to some of those dreaded alumni events where you're like, I don't want to talk about myself this whole time. It was fun to have unity, and the fact that we were all kind of trying to figure it out ourselves.
Yeah, I'm sure it was like super reassuring to like hear that other people are in the same boat as you. Um, Even if everyone just feels like they don't know what's going on. And I think it's okay to like kind of lean into not knowing what's going on. Again, like kind of going back to our LinkedIn episode, right? Like kind of strengthen skill sets that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have that time before going into the workforce. Those soft skills is what we kind of coined it as, not coined it, but use that terminology. Um, but yeah, I think it's always great to have reassurance from other people that are in your same kind of group, your same circle, going into a different phase of life. So yeah, that's super important.
Well, I think you brought up something, Priscilla, that I think is really interesting. You said that nobody was probably more than maybe 10 years our seniors, so like probably nobody before the class of 2013 or so. And I think that's very interesting about who chooses to engage in alumni events, because when someone's only like 10 years older than us, right? Like maybe they've ascended to like the managerial, like supervisory kind of roles, but I wouldn't say that they're yet at kind of like the executive senior leadership, like C-suite level yet. And what I mean by that is, like, when you're like starting out in your career, I think what would have been helpful is being with people who were like in charge of hiring, are the decision makers of if a position um does, right, like get on the docket for recruitment, right, or they can just bring you in, right, on some kind of like fly off the whim, right. We not interfacing with those kind of alums because they don't show up to the events because of whatever reason, I think also probably has a bit of an effect, right, on how effective the alumni networking is.
Specific event that I was mentioning, I would definitely say was the one off for seeing recent alum. Because I don't know, for me, in the reverse of that, I tend to find that many of our alumni events are filled with those people that are the C suite people, or you might have a VP of, a COO or something. I find that like one event I'm thinking of in particular was centered around Women's History Month that we did. It was where we had essentially women of various backgrounds, professional backgrounds come. And I found that a lot of those women, respectfully, were in these huge C-suite roles. And while I get your point, Jahari, that sometimes, it's cool to meet people like that, I kind of am the opposite, where like I would prefer to talk to that managerial, or that person in that manager role, than the C-suite individual, just because I've personally felt like the conversations I've had with individuals in those roles, to me, were a lot more informative for where I was at currently, or where I'm currently at as a young professional. That's not to say C-suite and VP level role individuals don't give meaningful advice, but I tend to find that a lot of that advice is very more, I guess you can say, aspirational and less practical. I feel like it sometimes can be very vague, from past conversations I've had with people of that higher seniority level at organizations. But I definitely see that point, that there is a kind of benefit of having conversations with people in those roles, because sometimes they have the ability to bring in young alum probably more practically, versus someone who's in a manager role who may can only bring someone in on their department of expertise.
Okay, maybe that was a good fine ending point for that side of the conversation. So let's talk about moving back home.
Yeah, I
The
think
other side to the graduation year. I mean, some people move out on their own and they move right to new cities, which means that they have to live on their own, right? Or with a roommate. But I don't think any of, well, Priscilla, you have experience like that.
A peer of mine who was older by 1 year, she was leaving the country, and she had a lease that was concluding in September, and I decided to pick up her lease. So I subrented from her from basically May, the week after graduation, all the way up to September. That was something I did because I was working after graduation. I didn't want to go home. Truthfully, I truthfully I felt like to use the words "I needed a break" isn't even fair, because I haven't been home and outside of COVID, being home for COVID, I never went home for summers. I usually had a fellowship or internship that was usually in Memphis, or which is college town, or I was working at the time, and I wouldn't go home for that, since that wasn't the job. 100% of the time wasn't at home, and so I stayed in Memphis. It was great. I It was a 2 bedroom apartment that I stayed at. Had a roommate, which worked out really great. I'm the type of person that I could live with anybody. I don't have a problem living with anyone, as long as we have the mutual understanding that we have our space, and the common space area got to be clean. That's pretty much my rule of thumb. What's behind your door, I don't care. But and the apartment can't smell like, we got to keep the apartment clean. Essentially, our common spaces clean. So I lived with my roommate for that entire time. It was great. We were both working professionals, so we were both had 8-hour jobs, and it worked out perfectly. Where we had our own thing. We would see each other potentially when we were getting off work in the afternoon or leaving in the morning. But I spent those months in Memphis, having the ball. Having a really great time, and sometimes that's needed. You don't necessarily have to go right home. My biggest piece of advice is do what's in your means financially. I always tell people, there's always a going back home. I think is never the first option for a lot of people. I don't feel like it is, because the natural inclination is after graduation you're going on your own. But I would really encourage anybody who wants to move out on your own, whether that's doing like a short stint like I did, while you're employed in maybe the city that you're still in for college, or later on in the year, and current for me, where you move into a whole nother city for your new role that's far away.
Yeah, I guess I could speak more to the side of moving back home with your family. Um, Kind of to Priscilla's point, do what's in your means, but also don't be afraid to move back home if that's safe for you to do. Um, I know for me, it was super important kind of saving up my money to be able to purchase an actual home. I'm not really big on the renting side of the world just because at the stage of life I'm in, personally, I just want to be able to own things instead of, kind of spending my money on something that doesn't. Which, again, like weigh your options because do what's in your means. I love
Are
that
you trying
Priscilla
to
said
become
that.
a real estate investor, honey?
No, not
I
at
was just
all.
about
Not
to
at all.
say,
I just
for some people, Brittany,
I'm,
the math comes out more affordable.
No, that's what I'm
I,
saying. Like I said, like I love the sentence that you've said, weigh your means, because for me, the investment in renting doesn't make sense, but for other people, it makes total sense. Like you don't have to do maintenance on your own. You don't have to take care of a lawn, et cetera, right? But I think just looking at the economy right now, it was important for me to move back home so I could kind of save up on my first paychecks and put it into savings so I could have a down payment on, a house, which was kind of important for my next move in life. But you just kind of have to think about what's important to you and how you can get there where you're not, in financial trouble down the line. Um, and again, just weigh your options, weigh what makes sense to you, what doesn't, and go from there.
well, like I said earlier, the economic state of the
It's
country
not
is
great.
dwindling. So, it is. eh, it's a domino effect, right? Like, okay, you graduate from I mean, and of course, this podcast is very like college centric because that's what our experience is. But we have a situation where, like, okay, you graduate college, you're entering into an upended job market that's laying off people more than they're hiring people, right? They're going into a hiring freeze to be able to conserve money. You can't find a job, which means you cannot afford rent, right? Okay, you do find a job when you've been struggling against your tier of hirers, early career people with like maybe 3 to 5 years of experience, and even mid level people who are going back in their advancement just to get a job. And they're going to pay you less. They're going to pay you even less than they would the normal person to get this job. And if you live in, and I'm specifically speaking for people who live in big city, New York, Chicago, LA, DC, Miami, Atlanta, you know, um, you can't afford to live there, right? If you're making 45, 50, 55, like you cannot really afford to live in those
You're
cities
cooked.
on your own. Well, I was gonna say it that way, but yes. Well, yes, they are. Yeah, they are. Yeah, things are ass backwards right now. So, yeah, you're not necessarily in the best state of things, and I think it's okay to um kind of realize where your stance is, right, and not to put too much expectation on like,
What
oh,
your
I should have
parents did.
moved out, right, right. I should have been moved out by now. I should be on my way to home ownership in a few years, right. I should, um, be in this kind of apartment instead of that kind of apartment. I think that's a little less talked about, right? The new high-rise condos in the gentrified areas of the city versus the apartments, right, in the traditional kind of neighborhoods. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think the timeline on everything is a lot different than, the generation before us. Not to say that they're that much older, but like it, it's changed a lot in the last few years. The economic like structure of just where we live, and it's very difficult to take different moves that are parents did. And I guess sometimes, they have that expectation that you have the same kind of layout of life that they do, but just have those conversations with them and see what's right financially for you with where you come out like of college, whether you have a full-time job, what that pay is, um, what that looks like for you, So
Yes. I think to Brittany's point, to even expand on that and even more, I mean, even if we look at it in the context of not even looking at our parents, if we look at the current job market 5 years ago, I would argue it's just, even 10, it's just transformed so much.
mhm.
And gone are the days that, I don't want to say it's completely gone because there are some individuals we graduated with, some of these individuals who, had something secured, guaranteed after graduation. But like, gone are the days where, just knowing somebody was enough to get the door open to, in the sense of job hunting of things. Like, I think for all of us, we had multiple people we knew at organizations that we would have loved to work for, but that alone wasn't enough to get us into the door. So I think it's to Brittany's point, don't let the typical timeline of like, oh, this is I'm falling into the dreaded stereotype of the 20-some-year-old still living with their parents, because it's, I
Right.
mean, it's common. I mean, I've seen multiple news articles since we've graduated about it, and it's just, my advice would be, I would rather, I guess, have the so-called unpopular image of me living at home with my parents in my 20s than going out in the world and being broke and ruining the credit and everything else that the world says we got to have put together to succeed in life, just to fit the image of, well, I could say I could live by myself. Because for some people that might be worth it, but I don't think it is. Your own self-destruction.
Yeah, I don't think you should live for anybody else, right? Like you shouldn't live in trying to perform a certain level of comfort, a certain lifestyle, a certain, just state of being, right, for other people. And I guess that kind of contradicts my point earlier about going to homecoming or going to alumni events when you feel a sense of insecurity or anxiety around questions that you may be asked. But I'm just going to hold that contradiction. I'm not going to go backwards.
No, I mean, I think it is important to have conversations with people that you graduated with, right? Because even when we're talking about, the job market or just like economy in general being different, 5, 10 years back, we have a different perspective talking to each other than we do talking to, people that are in their 40s, 50s and have like a stable life, right? Because they're like, "Oh, like why didn't I moved into a house, by 25. Like why aren't you thinking about that yet?" And then you talk to people your age and they're like, "Yeah, I'm living at home too." So it's important to have, that that security or that reassurance that you're not alone in something. It's always better to feel that way when you're kind of surrounded by people that are outside of your age group now when you move into corporate world, that you still have those conversations with people your age, like, oh, like, please make me feel better that I'm living at home and I'm thinking about these things XYZ than people that are like, I don't know why you're not thinking 10 years down the line. It's like, I'm just trying to get through the next 2 months. Yeah, thanks so much for tuning in this week. I hope you got some good advice coming out of college in those few months between, graduation and homecoming. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.